Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. And in this episode, I want to talk about GI Blues, a 1960 musical comedy starring Elvis Presley. So, this is the second Elvis movie that I've watched. The movie stars Elvis Presley. I've watched things about him before, but this is one of the actual Elvis movies. It's not one of his best films, according to practically everybody. Most people wouldn't even put it near the top of his movie list, let alone like all time great movies or anything. But it's still an important movie in a way because it marks a turning point in Elvis's career and in how Hollywood wanted him to be seen. So, GI Blues came out in 1960 and was directed by Norman Taurog. Now, Taurog was a respected director, though film historian David Quinlan once described the Elvis movies as the only dull spots in Taurog's career, which is not very subtle. It's basically saying, this was a dark point in Norman Taurog's career as a film director. So the film is set in post war West Germany, where Elvis plays Tulsa McLean, or McLean. I forgot how that's pronounced. But anyway, he is a U.S. Army soldier stationed overseas. So you've got that background going on. And, well, it's not really a background, it's actually more of something that's in the forefront. Tulsa isn't exactly thrilled with army life. Like a lot of movie soldiers, he spends his off hours singing in a nightclub with his fellow GIs to make extra cash. So everybody needs a hobby, and hey, why not try to cash in if you can? And that nightclub is important because it gives the movie an excuse to stop the story every few minutes and let Elvis sing another song. And honestly, that's mostly what GI Blues is, a thin plot holding up a soundtrack. Tulsa has his eye on a cabaret dancer named Lily, along with other people. She's not a bad looking lady, and she is played by Juliet Prowse, who is not a bad looking lady. She's known as an ice queen in the movie, and she assumes that Tulsa is wealthy because a number of Elvis Presley's pals in the movie are trying to plant the idea in his or in her head that yes, he is wealthy. And part of the story hinges on a bet between Tulsa and his fellow soldiers that he can win her over within 24 hours while on leave in Frankfurt. And part of that bet is to just lie about Tulsa and say that he's from a privileged background, and if she gets with him, maybe she'll have access to some of that sweet cash or something like that. So there's an implication that she's a gold digger, that sort of thing. So there's also the idea that Tulsa dreams of something beyond the army. He wants to open a nightclub of his own after his service ends, but the movie never digs very deep into that. It gestures at ambition and then moves on to the next song. And the plot is, I guess you could say, predictable. There's no real suspense. You know where it's going almost immediately. And in a way, that's fine because the movie isn't pretending to be anything else. It's mostly just cheerful, clean, and extremely controlled. That this isn't a movie that's trying to give you a thrill a second. It's nothing like that. There's no convoluted stories that you would have to take mental notes on or actual notes. It's very straightforward. You're not going to get lost as you watch it. So, I mean, basically, it's kind of dumbed down for a general audience, and you can really tell that. I'm not being mean to the movie. I don't think anybody would say that I'm being totally unfair or anything like that. And there's barely anything to report in terms of conflict in the movie. There's no grit, no emotional risk, no real challenge for Elvis as an actor. He's supposed to be charming, relaxed, and good looking, but the movie never asks him to, you know, stretch, I guess you could say. And what does matter is the timing of this movie in a way. That's actually one of the more interesting aspects of it, and one of the reasons you might want to watch it if you want to be sort of a film historian or whatever regarding the use of popular musicians in film. So this was Elvis's first film after returning from real-life military service, and that mattered a lot in 1960. His manager, named Colonel Tom Parker, was very intentional about using Elvis's army service to sort of reset his public image. In the late 1950s, Elvis had been controversial. Parents worried about him, critics talked endlessly about his hips. He was when he was on TV, he was shown from the waist up a lot of the time. But now here he was in uniform, smiling, polite, and wholesome for a general audience. The New York Times critic Bosley Crowther even wrote that whatever else the army had done for Elvis, it had taken the taken that indecent swivel out of his hips and turned him into a clean, trustworthy American young man, that sort of thing. So again, taking that indecent swivel out of his hips, that was considered so important at the time. You can't have people having fun, and if they move their hips too much, it's too sexually suggestive, and that sort of thing. And that's giving you a glimpse into how conservative logic has always been. Everything's a moral panic at some point. Like even dancing is considered, oh, it's the end of the world. Back in this time, this era, so Elvis was basically trying to clean up his image. So in that sense, this film might be considered a little bit more historically important and relevant than you might initially think, because it's actually a pretty decent snapshot of somebody trying to seem less controversial, more, I guess, desexualized, for lack of a better expression, um, for uh, for a general audience, and it's probably more of a kids movie in a way too. Like they were probably very aware of conservative parents not wanting their children to be corrupted by this devil music that's rock and roll. I mean, what's funny about a lot of these modern musicians is they kind of forget that rock and roll really did pave the way for a lot of modern entertainment. It was really a genuinely rebellious kind of thing that was going on, and I think people need to put that into a proper context, and quite often they forget to do that. Not only were bands like Black Sabbath and Iggy and the Stooges and other bands, not only were they controversial, but even like music like Elvis was originally actually considered highly controversial. And that's despite him always being, relatively, you know, he didn't like sacrifice animals on stage or anything like that. He never exposed himself on stage, to my knowledge, or anything. So, the mere fact that he was dancing around in a semi provocative manner, that was enough to send these fearful conservatives into a frenzy. And I'm sure there was talk about, the need to purge the country of this dangerous uh, icon. So, yeah, this movie put him in a somewhat different space, I suppose. That's exactly what the Elvis GI Blues era represents. Commercially, that strategy actually worked. The movie was a hit. It ended up as the 14th highest grossing film of 1960, earning about $4.3 million. It won a Laurel Award for Top Musical and picked up multiple award nominations, including Grammys for the soundtrack. So, not really that bad, for sort of a movie that's considered on the generic side. And the music is the main reason people still remember this movie. Although, like I just suggested, it does have some potential to be studied as like a transformation of a public image, and I think that's my main takeaway about this movie. The soundtrack leans toward pop and light folk rather than Elvis's earlier rock and roll edge, and that disappointed some fans, but it appealed to a much broader audience. The title song, GI Blues, sets the tone. You also have Pocketful of Rainbows, which is gentle and pleasant. Did You Ever is another song, which, in my opinion, is the weakest song in the movie. It's just kind of annoying to me. I don't know. I didn't like that one. And the song Wooden Heart, to my mind, and I suppose my soul, if you want to word it like that, Wooden Heart stands out as like the best song in the movie. It uses accordion and has this sort of European folk feel. And like I said, it's probably the best song in the film. It actually became a hit, especially outside the United States. And if I was going to choose one song from this movie for you to check out, I think it would be Wooden Heart. And there's even a briefly strange, almost meta moment where Elvis gets into a fist fight with someone who starts playing Blue Suede Shoes on a jukebox to drown out the sound of Elvis's band performing live. So basically, it's Elvis versus Elvis. you know, it's a little bit odd. I kind of like that moment actually for that reason. And the movie accidentally comments on Elvis competing with his own past. If you think about it like that, he's basically saying that's not me anymore because he's literally fist fighting somebody uh, for playing one of his older songs. And I do wonder how Elvis felt about that. Maybe he didn't really think about that too much, like what it meant, but it is potentially a symbolic moment of deeper significance than you might originally think. If you really think about that, like literally getting into a fist fight with somebody as a plot point because that person is representing the past of music, and like Elvis is kind of saying, I'm going for a softer, more gentle image now. Uh, but then again, he fist fights, so I don't know how wholesome that actually is if you really think about it. But it's an interesting moment, and over time, GI Blues has taken on a specific reputation. Critically, it's often seen as the beginning of Elvis's assembly line movie period. Exotic locations, simple romance, lots of songs, low stakes, and that formula would dominate much of his film career throughout the 1960s. Fans tend to enjoy GI Blues for Elvis himself rather than any story. And I'm sure the existence of some attractive ladies doesn't hurt either, as well as those who are swooning over Elvis himself. And his screen presence, it does carry the movie in a way. The rest is pleasant but forgettable. But if you're an Elvis fan, you're probably going to like this movie well enough. And if you're interested in Elvis as a cultural figure, especially in how Hollywood reshaped his image after the army, then GI Blues is worth watching. It shows exactly how carefully his public persona was managed, which is another interesting thing. If you look behind the curtain, you might not always like what you see, but that's why these people have these public personas that are sometimes carefully choreographed. I was gonna say carefully choreographed. uh, I like to invent tongue twisters where there really aren't any. But anyway, if you're looking for a strong film on its own terms It's more of a curiosity than a standout. Ironically, Elvis once said about his real army service, I had quite a few interesting experiences, slept out in the snow, ate through rations, and to be honest, that probably would have made a more compelling movie. In fact, I have no doubt about it. If they showed a more accurate depiction of his time in the army, I think I think that could have been a somewhat more interesting movie, but that's not what they choose to make. Hollywood wanted to make GI Blues, and in 1960, that version of Elvis worked. And if you've seen this movie, I'm curious about what your thoughts are on it. Did you enjoy it? Am I sort of over exaggerating the movie as a little snapshot of this transitional period and the nature of the music industry trying to separate somebody from their previous, more rebellious image? Is it sort of the moment where Elvis was more of a clear sellout than just a rebellious rock star, or was he always a sellout? I don't know. Maybe you would say he was always kind of phony. I don't know. you know, People would be offended by that suggestion sometimes, but Elvis was never my favorite musician, and I know I'm going to take some heat for this, but I've never considered him the king of rock and roll for the simple reason that he didn't write his own songs, ever. I know he helped with the arrangement of the songs and all that, but if you're going to be called the or crowned the king of rock and roll, you should at least write some of your songs. I mean, come on, that's sort of obvious. Um, but I would say he was, you know, called the king for a reason, and it wasn't just marketing. He did help popularize the genre, so I don't want to minimize that too much. But if you're going to be at the tippy top, I think you should be someone who wrote more of your lyrics and your own songs and that sort of thing. And I know that's a controversial view for some people, but there it is. I'm saying it. So let me know your thoughts on that and tell me how far you know, off the right track I am. I think I think Elvis is still a controversial figure all these years later, and this movie itself is not totally free of controversy. So that's about all I have to say about it, and you have a good day. Bye bye.